This is Chapter 7, Section 3, The Republicans' Political Revolution. So we're going to take a look at Jefferson's presidency first. So, the Midnight Judges. After the election of 1800, the outgoing Federalist-controlled Congress, remember this is John Adams, he's leaving office, and Congress is also turning from majority Federalist to majority Democratic Republicans. So after the election, the outgoing Federalist-controlled Congress expanded the number of federal judges. And if you remember, federal judges are appointed for life by the president. So the Federalists are basically trying to maintain some type of control over the federal government as they are being forced out of office by opening up a number of judge spots for Adams to appoint, of course, Federalists to these new positions. And that's exactly what Adams did. In his last days as president, he appointed Federalists to the new judge positions. The appointments that Adams made were made in time. They were made by the time he left office, but not all of the appointments were processed before Jefferson was inaugurated. And so Jefferson said that these appointments were invalid because they hadn't been processed. They were made but hadn't been processed. And so he said that they're invalid. So his Secretary of State, James Madison, refused to process the paperwork that the Federalists had started. Now, one of the would-be judges, one of these guys who was appointed but not yet processed, his name was William Marbury. He petitioned the Supreme Court for his position, and it became a landmark Supreme Court case known as Marbury versus Madison. He said that the Judiciary Act of 1789 gave the Supreme Court the right to force Madison to turn over the paperwork. Now, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time was John Marshall, who was a Federalist. So you would think that John Marshall would find in favor of Marbury because he would want more Federalists on the court. But John Marshall was a pretty fair person. He did what he believed was right in line with the Constitution. It wasn't necessarily about his own political gain, but what he felt was right, and that's the type of judge he was. So anyway, so he actually found that the part of the Judiciary Act of 1789 that Marbury was trying to use in this case was unconstitutional, and so he voided it. He said that the Supreme Court should not have the power to do this, and so he voided it. Basically what happened is the Constitution had outlined in what cases the Supreme Court would have original jurisdiction, that they would be the original court to hear a case. The Constitution says that there are specific cases that the Supreme Court can be the one and only court that hears a case. All other cases have to go through district courts and circuit courts and things like that. He said that the Judiciary Act had added to this list in the Constitution, and Marshall said that Congress did not have the power to extend original jurisdiction in the Supreme Court, that they couldn't just add things that the Constitution had specifically listed. So since this case fell under that added list, which he said was unconstitutional, he ruled that the Supreme Court did not have jurisdiction over the issue and could not enforce the appointment. So besides not enforcing the appointment, the more important thing about Marbury versus Madison is that it established the Supreme Court's right of judicial review. Judicial review is the right to decide if a federal law is constitutional or not. And if it's not, then the court can overturn it. And if you think back to the Alien and Sedition Acts and the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, that, that sort of thing was controversial, where the states were overruling a federal law, and no one really knew if the states had the right to do that or not. It wasn't in the Constitution, but here in this Supreme Court case, it established a precedent that it was only the Supreme Court that had the right to determine the constitutionality of a law, and that is what judicial review is. Okay, reducing the size of the federal government. So Jefferson wanted to reduce the size and the power of the federal government. He believed that the Federalists had made the central government too large and too powerful. So he reduced taxes, he reduced the size of the standing army, and he reduced national spending. But he will make one big decision that expands the power of the president and goes against his strict constructionist beliefs. And that is when we decide to start moving west and purchase the Louisiana Territory. So here's what happened. Napoleon Bonaparte was the ruler of France. We looked at that after the French Revolution. And he was trying to expand the French Empire in Europe and America. So he entered into a secret treaty called the Treaty of San Ildefonso in 1800, which returned Louisiana to the French. Spain had controlled it since the Treaty of Paris in 1763, and now with the Treaty of San Ildefonso, the Spanish are relinquishing their control over Louisiana and giving it back to the French. Basically because Spain doesn't really want a war with the French at this point. So Napoleon ordered officials to, at this point, resist American access to New Orleans, which was a huge trade port. And the Spanish had always allowed the Americans to use New Orleans, and Napoleon is going against that, and it violated a treaty between the U.S. and Spain called Pinckney's Treaty, which allowed the U.S. to use the port of New Orleans, as well as the Mississippi River. So the fact that Napoleon is not allowing it is violating Pinckney's Treaty. Jefferson doesn't want to go to war with France over this, but it is a very important issue for the U.S. So he sent Robert Livingston to France. He was an American ambassador. He sent him to France in order to purchase New Orleans. Just New Orleans. Jefferson didn't want to purchase the entire Louisiana Territory, he just wanted New Orleans. And initially, Napoleon was not willing to negotiate. He wasn't willing to sell New Orleans because, again, it's such an important port city. But very shortly after, Napoleon was starting to have some issues in one of his territories in the Caribbean, in Haiti. He was basically fighting to get control back after a slave uprising led by Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, and he was losing ground. Napoleon was losing ground, and he was also being threatened in Europe with war. If you remember the European coalition that was, trying to get him out of power and restore a monarchy. So he's afraid, because of his troubles in Haiti and because of his troubles in Europe and in France itself, that the U.S. would just invade and take Louisiana. So he offered to sell all of the Louisiana Territory to the U.S., not just New Orleans, but the entire territory, for only $15 million, which came out to about 3 cents an acre. So it's very, very, very cheap for the U.S. to purchase this land. So Robert Livingston, along with James Monroe, negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, and Louisiana was bought from the French. Now Jefferson had to use a loose interpretation of the Constitution to justify this purchase, the right to add territory to the U.S. was not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. It didn't say that the president could purchase land. It didn't say that the president could not purchase land. It just didn't say that he could. But since Jefferson was a strict constructionist, he believed that if the Constitution didn't give him the power to do something, then he didn't have the power to do it. But he goes against those beliefs in order to purchase Louisiana, one, because it fits into his agrarian vision for America. It's adding all this new open land that could be farmland. Two, because it doubles the size of the country. And three, it was so cheap. It was only 3 cents an acre. So he goes against his beliefs but and purchases the territory, but it ended up being a pretty good thing for the U.S. After he purchases the territory, he sends Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore this new territory all the way up the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, to just explore everywhere. And they returned with maps and catalogs of natural resources, the geography, the inhabitants, and as you know, they were led by, or helped along by, the Native American woman Sacagawea. Now, the New England states feared that with this new territory, they would lose their influence and power because they're just so small in size. So they ended up forming an organization called Essex Junto. And they openly discussed secession, or breaking away from the U.S., because they so much disagreed with the purchase of Louisiana. And the guy who was their leader was Aaron Burr. And if you remember, Aaron Burr's position in the government at this point is vice president. So here we have a vice president forming this organization to secede from the Union because of an action that his president took. Alexander Hamilton, again, a political rival of Aaron Burr, someone who never got along with Aaron Burr. Hamilton accused Burr of planning to destroy the Union. So Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel, because that's what you did back then. If someone insulted you, you challenged them to a duel. Dueling, by the way, was illegal at the time, but it was a common sight. They even sold dueling pistols as a set, so you can have both partners have or both participants, I should say, had the same gun. But anyway, so dueling's illegal. They do it anyway, and Hamilton was actually killed by Aaron Burr, the vice president of the United States, during this duel. So Aaron Burr was charged with murder, and he ended up fleeing. He moved out west in order to avoid a trial. And so not only has the vice president organized an organization to secede from the Union because of something his president did, but he also murdered someone and then fled to avoid trial. After Jefferson's term, or after Aaron Burr's term as Jefferson's vice president had ended in 1804, at the end of the very first term of Jefferson, Burr was involved in another conspiracy. He and General James Wilkinson, who was the military governor of Louisiana, planned on forming a new nation in the West where Aaron Burr would be the leader. But Wilkinson betrayed Burr and arrested him for treason. And so Burr was the first person tried for treason under the Constitution. He was acquitted, by the way, but he was still tried. Anyway, so these two events, the duel and the formation of Essex Junto, and then the other conspiracy of Aaron Burr, these two events show the beginnings of sectional tensions and threats to national unity. And we already start to see threats of secession from, it's from the opposite side than it was in the Civil War. The North is actually threatening to secede at this point, but we're already starting to see the differences between the North and the South. Okay, conflict with Britain and France. So the British and the French were not respecting America's neutrality during their war with one another. This is still going on. We're on President number 3 in this war with Britain and France. We are still neutral, but they're still not respecting that. The French were still seizing American ships. The British were still attacking U.S. ships and impressing our sailors. Again, Jay's Treaty had done nothing to solve that. So, in an attempt to avoid war, yet again, Jefferson persuaded Congress to pass the Embargo Act of 1807. The Embargo Act banned all international trade, like everywhere. We're not going to trade with anybody. His idea was that France and England would be economically hurt without U.S. trade. And so they'd want to get it back by agreeing that the U.S. had neutral trading rights, that they would stop attacking our ships and let us trade with the other side. Unfortunately, it didn't hurt England nor France because obviously they trade with other people. The U.S. is not the only country they trade with, but it did end up hurting the U.S. economy because we weren't trading with anyone else, so no one's buying our stuff. And so it backfired, and it had to be repealed in 1809 after James Madison became president. All right, so James Madison. James Madison was a Democratic Republican. He was elected in 1808. And the biggest thing that he's going to have to deal with is the War of 1812. So Republican congressmen began to pressure Madison to go to war with Great Britain. These men were known as the War Hawks. They were people like John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay. Madison demanded that the British respect America's neutrality and also America's sovereignty, respect our independence and our right to rule ourselves. Basically, both countries were treating the U.S. like less than a country. Well, when Britain didn't respond quickly, Madison asked Congress to declare war. He gave in to the pressure, and Congress did. Madison's the first president to ask for a declaration of war. Now, the war was very difficult. Remember that Jefferson had just reduced the size of the army and cut military spending. That's pretty bad timing. Not that he knew a war was coming, but it was bad timing for Madison that Jefferson had just reduced the size of the military. Also, another thing that made it difficult was that there were political divisions over the war, and that made it difficult to fight and finance. The Federalists in New England did not agree with the war. They thought it was too expensive. They did not want to have to ally with France. They don't want to have to choose sides, basically. And they did not want to add territory in Canada, which they felt like was going to happen after the war was over. We'd get more in Canada. So it became a very difficult war to fight and to finance, and it was also kind of a second Revolutionary War, trying to convince the British that we were a sovereign nation. Not much really happened in the war between the beginning and 1814. In 1814, the British sailed up Chesapeake Bay and attacked Washington, D.C., and that was a pretty big deal. That's the nation's capital. And in their attack, they burned a lot of buildings, including the White House. And this is when Dolly Madison, who was the first lady, saves the portrait of George Washington, his official presidential portrait, from burning in the White House. And she's really famous for doing that. So once the battle in Washington, D.C. was over, the British advanced to Fort McHenry in Baltimore. The American defenses held up in Baltimore, and the British actually had to retreat. So this was an American victory. But during this battle, an American lawyer and poet named Francis Scott Key was on board a British ship. He was actually negotiating the release of an American prisoner of war, and he was detained on the ship while the battle took place. So he watched the attack at Fort McHenry from the water and was so inspired by the American bravery and resilience that he wrote what would later become the U.S. national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. Just so you know, it's not made our national anthem until 1931, but it was written here in the War of 1812. All right, so during the war, the Federalists who had opposed the war felt very strong since it was not going very well. It looked good for them. So they held a convention called the Hartford Convention. And the purpose was to reform the U.S. government. They felt like they were, going to come out looking really good from this, so let's reform the government while we have everyone's attention. Secession was brought up again, but mostly the Federalists just wanted to revise the Constitution. For example, they wanted to put one-term limits on presidents. Both Jefferson and Madison were Democratic Republicans, and both were elected to 2 terms, and they didn't like that. They also wanted to say that the president cannot be from the same state as the president before him. Here we have Jefferson, Madison, and then later on Monroe will all be from the state of Virginia. There are 3 presidents in a row, all from the same state, all from Virginia. They called them the Virginia Dynasty. And so the Federalists didn't like that, especially because Virginia was a southern colony. They also wanted to change the Constitution and add embargo limits. Foreign trade was important for New England's economy, so they don't want to have a whole lot of embargoes like Jefferson was trying to impose with the embargo of 1807. And they also wanted to increase the vote requirement for Congress to declare war, to prohibit trade, or to add new states. They wanted to increase it to a 2/3 requirement. At this point, just a majority was needed, but they wanted it to be a 2/3 requirement. But luckily for the Americans, the British wanted peace by this time, and they were ready to negotiate. They knew that they were fighting a losing battle. Basically, Britain had been involved in war with France for 20 years now, and they lacked the money and energy to keep fighting in America. So negotiations began in Ghent, Belgium, and the Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24th, 1814. No border changes were made for either nation. No one gained or lost land because of this war. But it basically it ended the war, and it made Britain respect American neutrality and American sovereignty. Now, before the end of the war, before the news of the end of the war had reached New Orleans, Andrew Jackson led the American army into battle on January 8th, 1815. So the official war ended in December of 1814, but no one in New Orleans was aware of that because word had not yet gotten to them, and they fight a major battle in New Orleans after the treaty is already signed. It ended up being a very impressive victory, and for the Americans. Jackson defeated the British in the Battle of New Orleans, and it boosted American pride. And Jackson became an American hero. It's just ironic that one of the most important battles of the war happened after the war was already over. But had we lost the Battle of New Orleans, the British could have claimed rights to the port. So it's still important that the U.S. won this. So the Federalist Party, after the War of 1812, just fell apart. They had already been unpopular because of John Adams and the Alien and Sedition Acts and the XYZ affair. The American victories made the Hartford Convention look un-American, and they just became less and less popular than they were before the war. And so with the end of the Federalist Party is the end of the first party system. For a while, all we're going to have is Democratic Republicans. All right, the Second National Bank. So the First National Bank was created in 1791 with a 20-year charter. It was actually allowed to expire in 1811 during Madison's presidency. But after it expired, the national currency again experienced inflation and instability, much like after the American Revolution. So state banks were established that had overprinted banknotes, and so it was really, too much going on, too much power within the states printing currency and things like that, whereas under a national bank there was more stability in the economy. And so to resolve this issue, Congress created and Madison approved the Second National Bank in 1816 with a 20-year charter again. All right, and then the last president in this section is James Monroe. He was another Democratic Republican, part of the Virginia dynasty. He was elected president in 1816. His time in office, his 2 terms in office, became known as the era of good feelings. Mainly because since the Federalist Party had fallen apart, there was more political unity. If just for a brief moment there was a little bit of political unity. Relations with England were the best they had been in a long time. There was a strong sense of national pride and devotion to the U.S., this idea of nationalism. So things were pretty good when Monroe was president. But even though there was only one political party, and it seemed like there was unity, factions began to grow within the Democratic Republicans. And these would later develop into the second party system, and we'll discuss that in more detail in Chapter 10. There'll be the Democrats and the Whigs, but those aren't coming yet, not till Chapter 10. There was a landmark Supreme Court case when Monroe was president called McCulloch versus Maryland, and it dealt with the National Bank. This was in 1819. The Maryland legislature imposed an annual tax on the branch of the National Bank in Baltimore. They said that the National Bank had to pay $15 million to the state of Maryland. So here we have not 15 million, 15,000 to the state of Maryland. And here we have a state government taxing a federal institution, a national institution. So the bank said this was unconstitutional. A state institution cannot tax a federal institution. Maryland said they could because the bank was located within their state borders. So the issue was brought to the Supreme Court, and John Marshall was still the Chief Justice, and he found in favor of the bank. He said, this is, a federal institution. We can't have a state instituting power or control over a federal institution. So this is a significant case because it asserted the authority of the federal government over the state governments. That even within matters within the state, the federal institution is supreme. They have more power. One of the people who really made a name for themselves during Monroe's presidency was John Quincy Adams. This was John Adams' son, and he was President Monroe's Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams, or JQA, as he was known in a lot of the newspapers at the time, negotiated a lot of different treaties and settlements and things at the time, and so he earned himself the nickname the Great Negotiator. One of those things he negotiated was called the Rush-Bagot Treaty. This was a treaty with Great Britain where both agreed to reduce their military vessels in the Great Lakes. What was happening here was you had the British in Canada and the U.S. in America, and we basically share the Great Lakes, and so both countries had ships in the Great Lakes, and it was getting overcrowded, and they were starting to have skirmishes with one another. And so in order to prevent another war between the British and the Americans, we negotiated to both of us to reduce the amount of vessels that we held in the Great Lakes. Another negotiation John Quincy Adams did was he negotiated the northern border of the Louisiana Purchase with the British to be the 49th parallel. It wasn't super clear when we bought the territory from the French where the border was and how much belonged to the British and how much belonged now to the Americans. And so they decided with the British that it would be the 49th parallel, and that's actually where it still is today. He also negotiated with Spain and purchased Florida for $5 million. And he established the western border of the Louisiana Purchase. So with the British, we had to establish the northern border. With the Spanish, we had to establish the western border. And that treaty was called the Adams-Onis Treaty, to purchase Florida and establish the western border of Louisiana. But probably the thing that John Quincy Adams is most known for is writing the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine announced that European nations were no longer allowed to colonize or interfere in the Western Hemisphere. And if they tried, the U.S. would intervene to stop them. It also said that in return, the U.S. would remain neutral on European affairs. So we're not going to get involved in your stuff if you don't come get involved in our stuff here in the Western Hemisphere. So this is an example of an isolationist policy. You leave me alone, and I'll leave you alone. And that's largely what the U.S. was trying to do since the very beginning, was to stay isolated, to stay away from everybody and mind our own business. But at the same time, it declared the U.S. as the leader of the Western Hemisphere. We just put it out there and told Britain and France and all these other countries that you have to stay out of the Western Hemisphere because we said so. Now this is going to be later expanded upon by Theodore Roosevelt with the Roosevelt Corollary later on in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where he'll say that we're actually going to use force in order to back up our claims that you shouldn't colonize here. But it remained in effect for a long time, and England and the rest of Europe pretty much respected it, because if they wouldn't have, then it would have just led to yet another war with America.